Yeah, so I looked at this as, I suppose it depends what you class as a failure, poor results or horror stories. But and whilst I'm in a fortunate position that poor results haven't really happened for a long time, I definitely learned an awful lot for why they did do, particularly at the beginning of my career. But it was again all about that research and prospecting, that unsexy side of sales, just not done well. And the horror stories were and have been, I guess, few and far between. But thinking back, I think those failures definitely came from not giving the process time to develop and not being methodical in my approach. So I guess it was a failure in persistence, for want of a better word. And horror stories, I've definitely had several failures when emailing or getting in touch with several people in the same business in a short period of time with a very similar message. I think we've probably all been there. But as I mentioned earlier, what those prospects evidently didn't feel is the love, or they didn't feel cared for. It will have come across like a shot in the dark. So I was able to learn all about segmentation and personalization, which is something else that we've all mentioned previously. So, as an example, if you have an ideal customer, say it's a manufacturing and engineering firm, who's the profile in that business that you can work with? And often it's 3 or 4 different people, all with different job titles, different requirements, different decision-making capabilities. So what I would look to do is segment those out. And then say, as an example, the head of marketing would get one style of communication and one style of message, almost a campaign towards her or him. The founder would be another. And very simply, I suppose the opener would be a little bit more like, I know this doesn't sit in your day-to-day, but who within your team does this sit with? And then naturally some leverage and a call to action of, can you let me know who the appropriate person in the team is to speak to? Head of IT might be another one. Possibly not a buyer, again, depending on your product, but an influencer. So not exactly the right person. So the opener on any communication, and again, keeping that really short, would reference that. You'd want to spread the messaging out over weeks, so you never have a conflict. But what you do have is multiple messages to different people at different times. And I think what we're seeing an awful lot of is, and I think if people adopted that type of strategy, you'd be surprised how that style of correspondence generates in people in the team getting in touch who maybe you might or might not have already researched and prospected. So the amount of times we'll send a message to a founder, not hear anything back from him or her, but actually the head of marketing, the head of e-commerce, or the head of the CTO will get in touch and say, Corinne put this across to me. I'm really interested, and I'll fill her in when we meet. So naturally, then again, I suppose a failure could be not taking everybody else in that business out of your process. Then that can be quite laborious and manual if you've got the technology set up efficiently, but you've got to go back in and make sure that no form of BD goes to anybody in that business whilst the communication is evolving with that one individual. And then I think Pip mentioned right at the beginning, it's about being able to open doors and spread into potentially different departments or different sections of the business. So yeah, I think Pip mentioned about just wrote a note about gauging the timeline where the customer is. We've all done that before as well. Not ask the appropriate questions, expected a process to take this long and it can take this long. And I think what often people do, or what I've done in the past, is whatever product or service I was selling, because I was always working full-time for a business before Facests, for one business selling one product or service, was understanding where that product or service sat within that business's ecosystem and how important it was to that company. You might be 5th in line. They might have 4 other priorities. So I think Pip mentioned about managing that relationship effectively. I completely agree that you need to know where you sit in terms of the priority list and what the founders, the board, whoever's making the decision what's in their minds, even if you haven't spoken to them directly.